in government, we can have nice things.
I don't feel like Canadians know that.
People are losing faith in democracy and losing faith in our government.
This is the Functional Government Podcast. Hey, Dorothy, how are you?
Good, Alistair. How are you?
I'm better now you're here. Before we get started, obviously the whole point of this podcast is to understand why government services are the way they are before asking how they might be better. In kicking things off, we're talking to a few people who've been trying to make government more functional. And I think there's nobody better positioned to talk about that than Code for Canada. So before we get started, who are you and why should we listen to you when you tell us things about how government functions today?
I'm Dorothy Eng. I'm the CEO of Code for Canada. We are a national nonprofit that works with governments and nonprofits across Canada to create digital services that meet the needs of everyone in this country. And we've worked with over 50 governments and nonprofit partners nationwide. A lot of our work kind of falls within three buckets of support that we provide to government partners. The first we call digital solution co-development, which is kind of a mouthful, but really what we do is we kind of match make government teams with teams of digital professionals that we embed within government to co-create digital solutions while building the digital capacity of government teams. We also do something we call inclusive user research. This is where we test public digital services with diverse people across Canada, including people living with disabilities. And then finally, we do another service that we call options analysis, helping government teams to assess their own needs for their digital services, as well as their own kind of organizational constraints, and then create and recommend like an evidence-based plan to set them up for success for the long term.
Why does the government need people embedded with it in order to build good digital services?
Maybe that question is based on an assumption of who already exists within government, and do those people have adequate technology skills, maybe ones that are more in line with the pace of modern technology and how modern technology is changing? Do these people have that kind of educational background, experience, professional experience, being able to work with new technologies and develop with them and iterate on them? And often when you ask that question and then you kind of like zoom into different government departments, whether that is at the federal government or down to the provincial government, down to municipal governments, it's pretty hard to find that kind of technology talent, kind of like ubiquitous across the public sector, where when you think of technology and its role today in doing everything in our lives, that is ubiquitous, right? And so there is kind of a really big skills gap within government between the kind of expectations that the public has with the services that they expect governments to be able to provide, especially when it comes to like digital services, versus who they actually have and the skills they have in-house that can enable them to meet those expectations. So this is where we see a lot of those gaps existing in our work, and also playing that role of really helping governments to reflect on how that gap exists and ways they can close that gap, right?
Would the average Canadian be surprised at how non-technical a typical government employee was?
I don't know if they would be surprised. I would say in general, if you even asked the average person in the public, their own knowledge of technology, it's probably not that high. And I'm not saying that to kind of like diminish our collective knowledge as Canadians. But technology is like a very complex and complicated topic, right? It's not only a lot of components and things to understand in how it's built and what it's based off of and how to develop it and evolve it, but it's also constantly changing. And so even for those who are really well versed in technology and how it works, being able to keep up with that, it could be like a full-time job or even beyond that. I don't think, it's that surprising actually when you think about it, of how fast technology is moving and how governments are just not really well equipped to train up their own staff to be able to keep up with that, but also to be able to attract that kind of talent, especially the ones that are really like that have their finger on the pulse of where technology is going and how that can benefit better service delivery.
Is that because those people with technical skills have better, more lucrative options for their jobs, or is it because of people not considering a career in public service, do you think?
If you think of like labor markets and technology labor markets, there's many different lived experiences that make up an entire technology labor market in Canada. But yeah, I would say in terms of kind of general buckets, if we think of like new grads coming out of technology programs in post-secondary education, a lot of folks probably don't think of government as their first place of employment, right? Or places to look for careers. A lot of folks would look for technology careers in the private sector, where that kind of evolution and pace of change is that's kind of the industry standard, and people seek opportunities like that to grow their careers. On the other side, what we do find is increasingly across Canada, there are pockets of governments that are trying new ways of tapping into or gaining the awareness of technology talent in Canada. And I would say since we've started as Code for Canada, we have seen that needle like slowly moving. We are seeing different jurisdictions being able to attract technology talent. Like they see more postings for service designers or software developers in kind of more modern technology stacks than, your like the kind of .NET developers of the
Java coders. Yeah.
exactly.
And I will say,
before.
I had someone reach out to me the other day from the Ontario Provincial Police saying, do you know any developers who want to do a work term here? And I said, but some of the students that have a work term program and they're having trouble finding employment in the private sector. She'd never even considered talking to Waterloo's grads. There's a pool of people looking for work experience. There's a bunch of people who want new people and they like to give them a taste of maybe you want to consider a career in government. When I talked to folks from many countries, as you have at Forward 50, there's a sense of pride in working for the government. The folks from Taiwan, the folks from Estonia, the folks from Ukraine, they brag about working for the government. I don't hear people in Canada bragging about working for the government. Government has a marketing problem in a lot of ways, right?
I think government has a marketing challenge. I think the stakes are against them in terms of that kind of positive brand that attracts, modern tech talent that might want to work on more experimental things and, test new technologies. And that's hard to do in a place, that's highly bureaucratic, that has like many regulations that they have to follow or bylaws or policies. So it's not naturally like a super attractive place for new technology
Interesting.
talent.
So it's not so much the culture as the structure that you're going to have to work within that is sort of antithetical to the experimentation that a lot of digital creators want to be able to do.
I think that is one element of it. Like if we're thinking of what are the conditions of a place of employment or a workplace that kind of modern technology talent really appreciate or are attracted to, it's often those things of like being a bit more innovative, being able to experiment. And governments might have policies and rules in place that don't allow them to do that. Because over many decades, these policies has been in place, they might have then developed cultures around those kinds of policies that often this is what we see in our work, where if we come into a government partner trying to promote doing user research or doing user testing, we've heard responses of like, well, that's just not what we do around here, right? Like, yes, that makes sense in terms of delivering a good service, but we don't do that around here.
Do you think it's that people are saying that because they know it's not worth trying, or because that's the way of getting out of work? I mean, there's obviously a stereotype of the lazy government worker, but you and I both know hundreds of public servants who work really hard and are constantly battling the status quo. So is it because it's just they know ahead of time, or they assume ahead of time that they're going to be told not to do it? Let's double click on that for me. What is it that makes people go, oh, that's not what we do here?
I think that really the only way to start to answer that is actually to find examples and like highlight the use cases in government of the folks who have managed to make it happen. Because if saying, oh, that's just not what we do around here is so ubiquitous, that's just like the way it is across a lot of the public sector, then the only way to really understand why that exists is to look at a team that was able to make it work, to go against all of those odds. And there are numerous examples of that have existed, that are in existence today, or ones that exist in the past, right? Like the Ontario Digital Service, that group, which was no longer to be with that title, they had many examples. I remember in one of your use cases, Alistair, of like swimming upstream, right? It's like salmon kind of swimming against the current, or maybe using like a salmon ladder to go against that waterfall. seeing folks like that, and then kind of understanding like what is it about this organization that enables them to work in different ways. And I think there's often kind of like a culmination of different conditions that need to exist. I mean, certainly like executive buy-in is like a really important thing. You have a champion who is at the executive level who can kind of like be an umbrella to all of the work below. Also, there's like things like political will, right? Like, is there alignment with an actual current event or thing happening in the news that that team can kind of tag their work onto?
Yeah, that was Hillary's whole never let a good crisis go neglected, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Piggyback on whatever the hype of the day is to get real things done.
Yes, yeah. And then you kind of work your way down in those conditions of like, coming back to that talent piece of like, okay, so now you've got the kind of leadership conditions and that never let a good crisis go to waste. But then do you have the people to actually execute on that quickly? And at that moment in time when the ODS shipped a number of different kind of very resident centric products, they were able to leverage those conditions and make it work. And so actually the challenge is that how do you sustain that, right? Like how do you keep that going beyond just that one instance? And in some cases it works and sometimes it doesn't. And so maybe ODS is also as the example. They definitely shipped some great product. They left a really lasting legacy in terms of the work that they outputted, but the organization now has kind of been split up, if you will, into different
And I think
smaller
for listeners who aren't inside baseball like we are, Hillary is Hillary Hartley and the ODS is the Ontario Digital Service. And obviously there was also the Canadian Digital Service, CDS, which was very much tied to innovation at the federal level. It's interesting that none of those, ODS, CDS, in the US, we just heard 18F. These are all groups that are either government adjacent in the case of Code for Canada, Code for America, or within government, ODS, CDS, 18F, that seem to be getting dismantled. I mean, Code for Canada isn't, but Code for America certainly shifted to be more of a consultancy. It seems like, okay, we needed some outside brain trust to kind of kickstart tech adoption and show it was possible. Has that led to processes within the government? Like what's happening with CDS and ODS now that these organizations, these digital service specialists are no longer? Is their work being continued or is it just that like the status quo won?
So those two examples, I would say time will tell. Like I think with ODS, that title of that department is no longer, but where that might go, I feel fairly confident that the DNA from that group is like still infiltrating the Ontario Public Service somehow, will come out the other end in some fashion. And similar with the Canadian Digital Service, there are, I would say, one example of a group, a digital service team that has outlasted a bit longer and actually has done the kind of really hard work. If we think of like digital service teams as kind of like, maybe this sounds a bit crass, almost like a virus trying to infect a system, right?
You said infiltrate, yeah.
Infiltrate, yeah. Like you've got a human body, you've got this virus on the outside, and maybe that's the digital service group, and they want to kind of infect the system to get them working in a different way, one that is delivering better services to the public. One group in Nova Scotia, actually the Nova Scotia Cybersecurity and Digital Solutions Group, they've done the kind of really hard long work of building that mandate of that originally the digital service team, now kind of infiltrating or embedding right into their kind of like corporate IT or divisional IT strategy. And so now essentially there is only one way to do digital services, and it's through this group. And I know it was no easy feat to get that work done. I mean, that being said, when we kind of compare it to the ODS, like I said, of, what were the outputs that they were able to, ODS was able to ship a bunch of great products. Nova Scotia, maybe a bit different, right? Maybe not as many products that they can hang their hat on as ODS did, like with their Notify application and forms. But regardless, like essentially energy was spent in a different way, and so led to a different outcome for that team.
We should clarify for other listeners, the idea of building forms sounds awfully boring, but if you think about Google Forms, once Google built Google Forms, millions of people could use it for everything from party invites to surveys to research to product feedback to all kinds of things. And so the idea is that by building basic building blocks like forms or the ability to send notifications to someone, you now have these like Lego bricks from which you can much more quickly build new solutions. And one of the reasons that it takes a long time to build digital services is that we don't have a set of reusable Lego blocks that everybody has to reuse in a lot of parts of government. And so as a result, people are going and they're going and extruding plastic to be customized, and they're unable to take out one Lego brick and replace it with another, even though that's how we kind of build things in the public internet. I heard in the UK they did the same thing where Liam Maxwell and Martha Lane Fox basically said, you won't have any budget unless you go through us. And they just said, we have the ability to veto any developer that doesn't use the tools we say. How has that gone over in Canada?
That's a loaded question. I think that while I just mentioned Nova Scotia is certainly an example, a use case of being able to bring everybody into kind of a common central place, like a central source of truth of like, this is how digital services should get done. Everybody come here if you would like to get your services built. This is your one-stop shop. I think it's rare to find that example within different governments across Canada. I think there are still pockets that exist at a smaller scale, at department levels or divisional levels, but to find governments as broadly as like the way Nova Scotia was able to centralize it is harder, definitely harder to find, because ultimately it's about getting folks aligned on a shared outcome, right? And again, we come back to this example of like, do the conditions exist for that alignment to happen? Which means, one, there's like an executive leader up top who is also a champion for, this new way of working. There's also probably a crisis or political will that's like galvanizing all of this. Then you've also got that talent below, and all of those conditions to exist. It's pretty rare, I think, in a lot of governments.
We just talked to someone in preparation for an upcoming podcast who said that in his country there was a government party that ran on reform. And this was kind of their whole platform, was that we're going to reform services. And so they had services that people were standing in a queue for 40 hours that they modernized, and it turned into 8 minutes after your message is received by the app, your service has been completed. But it took the political will of the country to elect leaders who would then insist on this happening, right? And it feels like the challenge here is, as you said, it's this alignment of the planets where there has to be political will. There has to be executive leadership willing to say, this isn't how we've done it in the past, but it is how we're going to do it going forward. And then there has to be technical competence at the coalface to actually implement that, or partners like Code for Canada who can step in and help that. One of the things that we want to explore in the podcast is this idea that Canadians don't know how bad they have it. Anybody on the digital government side has heard me opine about how in 2010, UN thought we were the third best country in the world for digital government. Now we're number 47, which means that a quarter of all the nations on the planet are better than us at digital government. But I don't feel like Canadians know that. I feel like Canadians just complain about how long it takes to file taxes or where's my passport. We're currently celebrating your passport will be ready in 30 days or it's free. Like we've come to the Domino's pizza level of passport guarantees. For taxation, we're still paying outrageous amounts for tax preparation software. It's a tax on taxes. And you'd think that the citizenry would kind of rise up and go, look, this is the problem. We don't have a functional set of government services, and it's a burden on our productivity. It's a burden on our economics. It's a burden on our peace of mind. What's it going to take for the Canadian public to realize that this should be a platform issue?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think Canadians actually do realize our governments don't work for them. I think we are at a point where, and maybe it's subtle, but I think Canadians are turning away from government and towards the private sector. Recently the Edelman Trust Barometer comes every year, and that one recently was released. Trust in government by the Canadian public is at an all-time low. And so I do think that this is not one of these, like, Canadians are waiting for some other shoe to drop and then they're going to like be up in arms. I think already it's been happening. It's like almost like the cancel culture, like quiet quitting or something. Like they're just kind of giving up on any kind of hope or belief that.
Problem is, it's not like you can go, I'm going to change providers when it comes to taxation, passport, or park reservations. Like you have one choice, and you go to jail if you don't follow its rules, right? So I guess when you can't quiet quit and you'd like to, that turns into like mistrust at the ballot box and the kind of, culture of personality rhetoric we're seeing in political campaigns, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
three-word
exactly.
slogans are the manifestation of, I would like to quietly quit, but I can't because I have to keep using it because I'm a citizen.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's where, to me, things get scary, right? Because now you have people who are just losing all faith, and so then they ask, well, what other options out there? And it seems like, looking at what's happening around the world, like there's not a lot of great options. And so, what I'm afraid of is that people are like losing faith in democracy and losing faith in our government. But what we do see is that there are kind of rays of hope. Like, I would say, yes, it sounds super bleak and depressing.
Yeah, make me hopeful. Come on, Dorothy.
But we do have, so I mentioned we work with a lot of governments through this one service that we call Inclusive User Research. And this is our service that just like brings a lot of like warm fuzzies whenever we do this work. And essentially what we do is governments are, maybe they're developing a new form for their users. Maybe they're developing a new website and they want to get feedback from people on, is this website meeting their needs, or is this form meeting their needs? And what we do is we recruit people from our test participant community, because we have a whole bunch of folks just from the general public across Canada, actually a lot of them from more marginalized communities, to give feedback on government services. So we run these kind of like testing sessions, focus interviews between people from the public and people on government teams. And as you can imagine, it always starts off not great, right? It's always like pretty bad feedback, like, oh, this is not working. Like, especially any kind of tech website that has to serve people using an assistive technology, tons of bugs. We find like lots of blockers, like critical blockers. And maybe that doesn't sound great, but actually what happens is that by the end of those sessions, we've heard from both sides after they've kind of gone through an entire website or form, and they're like, wow, this really has a lot of room for improvement. What it leaves people off with is this realization that it's appreciation from the public that they actually had, an hour with a government, like a public servant, actually listening to their complaints, saying, yes, tell me more. Yes, tell me more. And that feeling, that is what starts to bring back trust, right? It's like public servants being able to learn from end users on how services are not meeting their needs, and end users being able to just express their concerns and like challenges in trying to access a government service. And when that dialogue happens, we find people leave those sessions just like coming out really kind of enlightened and like,
On both sides, on the citizen and the public servant. That's great. Yeah.
Exactly.
I mean, and this is one of the things I think people are very concerned about, the impact of technologies like AI on public sector employment. But I personally want a Canada where we can handle 95% of, social service claims automatically, so that government employees can go and see the other 5% and make sure they're okay. That to me is, we are going to be able to do new things when we're able to optimize some of this stuff. Let's switch to some practical examples. I know you've done tons of work with lots of different digital services. Can you pick maybe 2 or 3 that are like, here's a service we went into, these were the issues, this was what they wanted to come out with, what we tried to do, and then what the end result was? Which ones stand out for you?
We did some thinking on our end about like what was a nice story in the last couple of years that we felt really proud of in this work, and like, really proud to hang our hat on. And actually, the one that came to mind was a project that we did with the government of Nova Scotia. So I spoke about Nova Scotia earlier, and working through their cybersecurity digital solutions group, we were introduced to Nova Scotia's Department of Education and Early Childhood Development. So what this department does is they have a service called Nova Scotia School Book Bureau. So essentially, it's a service that lets educators, teachers across the province order learning resources. Like, they get all their textbooks there. They might get, if it's a science teacher, they get the Bunsen burner, they get the beakers. You can order all of those materials for your classroom through this book bureau service. And so EECD came to us saying, this website, it's really old. This is a legacy tool. We don't think it's really meeting users' needs, and we don't know what to do with it. It's so old. We could really use some help kind of understanding what is the path forward.
Did they know how much usage it was getting, or did they not even have good data on usage?
They didn't have much service data. They might have had some service data. It was incredibly hard to access because it was kind of like an old databases that not anybody, like not a lot of people knew how to navigate. So yeah, not a lot of like kind of evidence-based decision making in terms of what do we do with this thing. All that we know is that it's super old. It's like a legacy system. Also, I think in our kind of conversations with that team, the technology itself was kind of ending a contract, like they were nearing the end of the contract. And so really what the team was looking for was validation that they should just renew the contract with that existing vendor of like, okay, we know this thing's coming to an end. We know that
Is
they
that a
have
role?
another
Is that a role that Code for Canada plays sometimes, is sort of helping the public sector negotiate with the private sector?
So we don't help them negotiate, but we will help them. This was as part of our options analysis support services. We'll go in and essentially help a team to understand, their current service, their technology stack, the people within their organization that are needed to sustain the service. And then we make a recommendation to them on essentially the right path forward. And what that recommendation might look like is it actually might translate into a budget request to senior leadership, an RFP that goes to market. So essentially we just help to set up that government team for success for basically being like a smarter shopper when they're at this stage that Book Bureau was in. So we were tasked with helping them decide, make a recommendation on what they should do moving forward with this textbook ordering system. And so, we did our kind of current state analysis. We started with end users, right, with educators, kind of talking to them, understanding like, what do you like about the service? What don't you like? We talked to their own internal staff at Nova Scotia Book Bureau to understand, like, how do you maintain the system? What does the IT side look like? What does the business side look like? Really just like doing a holistic view of the entire organization and the people needed to sustain this piece of technology. And what came back was actually there was one it was one testimonial that came back from a user, an end user. It was a teacher, I believe. And this really just like galvanized all the feelings in the room. And we presented it to the partner. And it was basically something like this. It was like, why would I use this system to order textbooks when I can just use Amazon? It was basically like, this service is of no use to me. When there is another option out there that is much more efficient.
And they didn't even have data to show that use had been dropping off or anything like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So that kind of quantitative data was really powerful because when they didn't have the qualitative data, when they didn't have the quantitative, they had these qualitative testimonials. So from there, that really got the attention of folks. We then went through kind of the whole environmental scan of looking at like, what is the best solution that meets this organization's needs, that meets the user's needs, and what do we recommend going forward? And again, that kind of led to the next like really big aha moment for this project. So we were doing our environmental scan. We included like, do we just kind of do we recommend renewing the existing technology stack that they already have? Because that seemed to be the most like ideal option according to everybody's perspective.
And was that the sort of, when you got there beforehand, was that kind of, they'd already decided that's what they wanted and they just wanted you to say yes? Or was there a legitimate question?
I think there was a bit of mixed emotions, right? There were mixed opinions. There were some folks, I think, who were like, yeah, we know what we want already. Like, kind of just give us a report telling us what we know we want. Some other folks being like, wait, we're not really sure yet. This is why we're doing this process. We just want an objective recommendation that is really the best solution that meets our unique needs as an organization. And so we did the full analysis, and it turns out we do this big reveal at the final presentation. We share what the recommended solution is, and the one that we went with, because it was easiest to procure, it's easiest to maintain, it was customizable, but it isn't like a huge burden on a technical or organizational burden on the team. It ended up being Shopify, because really what this book ordering system, while, yes, there's inventory, yes, there's all these like complex backend processes, really it's to the user, it's kind of like an e-commerce site. Yeah. And so we revealed this, and I do remember in that presentation, like, people were like jaws dropped. No one was really expecting that as the final. They
were expecting you to say, "Oh, it's Drupal with Apache in this," right? And you were like, "No, use Shopify."
It's Shopify. So following that presentation, we talked to the stakeholders and understood, like, what were their concerns with this recommendation and how did they feel. And what seemed to be the general sentiment was this feeling of like we weren't expecting to be able to get like such a like. like such a nice thing. In government, we can have nice things and
Oh
simple
man,
things.
I'm sorry, that's going on the reel. Government, we can have nice things, says Dorothy. No, I think that's a really good point, because we often don't think about the ongoing cost of, like, if you're trying to hire an employee to manage that, you now can go to anybody who's ever had a Shopify store instead of like a much smaller
Exactly.
hireable group, right? If you have an
Yeah.
employee who gets to work on this, they're more excited to do so because those skills are valid in the private sector as well. And so I
Yeah.
think this is the stuff that people don't often think about in the technology decisions, is why it makes sense to be using modern platforms and to reconsider what tool might be possible. You start with the idea of what the tool is. We need a website.
Yeah.
And then you back into, okay, well, that means we're using either WordPress or Drupal, or actually no, as opposed to, we need a way for people to quickly select a list of items and enter payment and have them shipped using Canada Post. That's a very different thing. There's
Yeah.
an example I've used many, many times about Netflix. Netflix's genius wasn't that it did video streaming, because Blockbuster had streaming before Netflix. What Netflix realized is they stepped far enough back to say, the problem we have is we need to quickly deliver about 4.6 gigabytes of data, which is how much you can store on a movie, like a DVD,
Mm. Mhm.
somewhere in North America in about 3 days. And it turns out the US Postal Service is the fastest way to do that at a time when most people have dial-up modems, right? And so if you're able to dissociate yourself enough from the solution to ask what the problem is in a new way, you can see these examples that are like staring you in the face, right? So it
Yeah.
turns out Netflix's big genius was that 49-cent mailer. And then, the Postal Service is, I did the math once, it's like 225 kilobits per second if a DVD takes 2 days to get to you, and it's like 4.9 gigabytes. And it's 49 cents, and it's a felony to tamper with the product. So it's perfect, right?
Wow.
It's those kinds of like aha moments where people realize that they've had an answer all along if they just think about the problem differently. So
Mhm.
it sounds like for some of your service consultations, you're just helping them to think about the problem differently.
That's exactly it. And to think about the problem differently, but doing that through, user research, talking to end users, talking to frontline staff, really, really just talking to everyone to understand what is the current state of this service that you have? Where do you need it to go? And then what's the best path to get there? Like, you don't have to assume it's going to be renewing the existing, platform that you have that hasn't been serving you nor your users for the last like 30 years. We have teams working across different provinces, across the federal government, in the past and currently, that are really doing the hard work of not just helping government teams to build, design, and deliver better public services, but also building their capacity. And I would say that is, humongous lift that is like 10 times the amount of work than like maybe the evidence or the impact that you might see on the surface. Because really what that is changing processes, changing hearts and minds, changing behavior. That's really that long game.
So you really want those people to sort of sit with your technology expert and learn by osmosis so that they now
Exactly.
say things are possible.
Yes, yeah. So like if you think of in the private sector, that kind of like pair programming approach, right? To do kind of like better software delivery.
Where two developers sit next to each other working on one piece of code together.
Exactly,
Right.
yeah. And in that case, you've got two, maybe they're familiar with the same language or the same stack. In this case, what we're doing, think of it as like pair product management or pair, agile rituals or scrum masters.
Yeah, Brian Kroger at Prodacity said that when one of the things he suggested governments do is insist that whenever you're having technology delivered, you insist on pair delivery so that they can't send in a sales engineer. It's someone from you and someone from them does the work together.
Yeah. And if there was a way to like recommend or advise every government to work with their vendors in that way, then maybe we wouldn't be in this situation, right? Where capacity of governments is so low. A lot of things are outsourced to the private sector. And so a lot of institutional knowledge is lost in this over reliance on vendors. And this is the kind of like anti-model that we're trying to build and work on, right? To like restore their capacity one sprint at a time, right? Every product that we ship, we're trying to do it kind of like co-development and co-delivery. But kind of raising the bar for for public servants to know that this is an option, right? Like, actually, we don't need to just kind of hand work over to a vendor and assume they'll do it and then hope for the best that it doesn't end up, terrible or over budget or over time.
Yeah,
But
hope is not
actually,
a
like,
strategy, right?
yeah, exactly. Like building up their capacity to more effectively work with vendors so that really like they're meeting vendors where they're at. And we've heard from different vendors too that they are interested in having a more this like healthier, more equitable relationship with governments. Maybe not all of them, but there is pools out there of vendors that are keen to see also the digital capacity of governments built up to more effectively deliver services.
I guess if you're involved and it means that the product for our project is going to work properly, they'd rather have a successful outcome with you involved.
Exactly.
So if you can show that having Code for Canada involved raises the chance of the success of a project, that's great. Peeling back the layers to understand some of the systemic, cultural and structural issues and not just say, oh, why can't we code? Is super important as we try to understand why it is that the Canadian government isn't as functional as it could be today. So thank you so much, Dorothy, for all the work you do and for being here today.
Thank you, Alistair. Thanks for having me here.
Thanks for joining us on the Functional Government Podcast.